Welcome to another episode of the Time for Impact podcast. I'm Chris Wade from Time for Impact, and my co-host is here. Hi, Matt.
Hi, Chris. Here we are, another episode. Looking forward to another good conversation today.
Yeah, and we try to keep up the trend of having really interesting guests on the podcast with some innovative and some strategic and groundbreaking insights into all things volunteering and social action. And I think we've kept that trend going, Matt. We're very lucky to be joined today by Stephen Greene, who is here with two hats, although he's only wearing one of those hats at the moment. All will be revealed as we get going. But Stephen brings, for me, a wealth of insight, history, and innovative ideas around particularly engaging young people in volunteering and community and social action. Stephen was the founder and chair of the National Citizen Service, and he'll tell us more about that as we get going, no doubt, but is also the chief executive of RockCorps, surely one of the coolest volunteering organisations on the planet. How's that for an introduction, Stephen? Welcome to the podcast.
I like it. It's a real pleasure to be here and see you again, Chris.
So, Stephen, we've met several times over many years, but you've got a very interesting backstory, and maybe that's a good place to start how you got involved in volunteering in the UK, because people may have picked up on your accent as well. And maybe you can, tell us how both RockCorps and NCS came about with your stewardship.
Yeah, great. Well, why don't I take the RockCorps part first, because that really leads into my involvement with National Citizen Service with NCS. RockCorps is 20 years old this year. If you haven't picked it up by now, I'm American by birth, British by choice. RockCorps was inspired and came out of the events, the terrorist attacks in 2001 in New York. And there was a real moment then in New York and many places in America and the world where we just kind of stopped. It was a horrible tragedy, but people stopped and strangers were talking to strangers. The normal rules of society were kind of suspended. Are you okay? Did you know anybody? Do you need any help? What's going to happen next? Who did this? Just a real sense of togetherness and community. That kind of dissipated, but people in New York really started to reimagine the city and public spaces and our relationships with government, nonprofits. And, we noticed that the people who are often excluded from that conversation are young people, right? So teenagers, early 20-somethings are often thought about as a problem to deal with. Are they getting the right education? What about the antisocial behavior? Is there enough housing? Are there enough job skills developed? They're always a problem to be managed as opposed to an asset that's part of the solution for our neighborhoods and our communities. So my friends and I thought we could do something with music. So we're all sort of in the music business in some sense. Now, the classic music intervention in a social issue is the benefit concert. In fact, there was just a big one last week in Los Angeles called Fire Aid, where you sell really expensive tickets, $1,000 a ticket, $10,000 for a table, or you live stream it and ask people for donations. Now, again, who does that exclude? Young people or people without means. So we thought, rather than money, maybe we could create a benefit concert that used time as its currency. Now, time is fascinating in many ways, but it's the most democratic measure known to humans. Your hour is the same as my hour, no matter how much money or how little you have, an hour is an hour. So we came up with this idea that instead of buying tickets, you would earn tickets by using your volunteer time. Now, how that worked in practice is we rented out Radio City Music Hall, a great theater in Times Square. And for the 2 months before the concert, we booked 9 acts. It was way too many. We've learned since. But 2 months before, we organized a series of 75 different community projects around New York in partnership and for the benefit of local nonprofits. But we actually did the logistics. So we registered the young people, we brought the equipment, we brought the food and drink, we did the health and safety, we bring a sound system and played music. And we would work at a homeless shelter, a food bank, a clinic, a care home, a park. It didn't really matter. We're issue agnostic. The idea is to get young people to come probably for the first time and try volunteering and earn a ticket to the gig. So using the ticket as the carrot to get them to try volunteering, discover their civic muscle, and go back again and again. And it worked, and it does really work. So, I'll talk a little bit about our recent big gig we did this past year as part of the Olympics in Paris. And we just did a 6-month on survey, and 47% of the 15,000 volunteers in the arena in Paris have gone back and done volunteering within 6 months of the gig. So once you try it, you go back, you've discovered this new muscle, as I say. Yeah. So that's us. We're a little in between. We're neither fish nor fowl. I mean, the question is, are you a concert promoter or are you a community organizer? The answer is yes. The whole thing is paid for by brand partners. So we're not a charity ourselves. We are a shareholder-owned company that sells these programs to big brands, so they get a marketing benefit out of it. We don't work with CSR. We work with their marketing and communication budgets with a social purpose benefit. So the brand will say, are you marketing and communication or are you social purpose? Again, the answer is yes. And finally, for the audience, are you a gig or are you a volunteering opportunity? And the answer is yes, we're all of these things. So that's RockCorps. Went well in New York. We took it around the States. We thought pretty early on, with no reason to think we were able to do this or capable or should be the ones to do it. We thought this is an international idea. We could see the response of the audience, the nonprofit charity partners, the brands. And when you're sitting in New York, it seems like London would be the place to go. We were met with some resistance in London. People said, British youth are not like American youth. You guys are kind of raw, and they're not really going to get into this. We're more cynical here. We found a sponsor. We did our first gig in Royal Albert Hall. We did about 100 projects around London, and it worked even better than in America, right? There was something, I think, about young people being welcomed in. And, Albert Hall is almost like the special room in England, right? It's a place where you don't go. It's got the good china in it. And we did a big hip hop show in there. And the audience just loved it. And we were off and running from there. Since then, we've done these gigs in 10 different countries, 6 different continents, several different languages, and we're going again. Shortly after we did this Albert Hall gig, well, maybe a couple years later, after the 2010 election, there was a conservative Lib Dem coalition. And we got this call. We never took any government funding. We never looked to government for any kind of advice or funding. In fact, we wanted to be separate from that because I think part of the problem with volunteering is it can look a little bit too institutional, right? So it's not for me. That's government, or that's what the schools do. It's not for me. So we never really worked closely with governments. We tell them we're there. So we got this call from an aide at 10 Downing Street. There was an advisor then, a guy named Steve Hilton. He was kind of the architect behind David Cameron's Big Society. They said, this Steve Hilton wants to see you. Oh, why not? I've never been to 10 Downing Street. That sounded pretty fun. And Steve is kind of a kooky dude. He never wears shoes. He kind of wanders around in his socks. And so I was like, okay, I'm having a very English experience here. This is really eccentric. But I explained how the whole thing works. He's like, I know all about it. I just want to know how you get these black, white, rich, poor, kids from the north, south, all working together in the community and loving it. And how can we get involved? I said, well, you can't get involved, but I'll explain how it works. Well, you got to meet the boss, I'm not sure. A couple of weeks later, they invited me down for a dinner. And I had to call my friends back in Portland, Oregon. I'm from the really progressive West Coast, right? Like growing up, never met anybody who voted for a Republican. So I was like, can I go see the conservative prime minister? I've understood since that politics here are a bit different, although they seem to be merging now once again. But politics were a bit different. And yes, you go see the prime minister, great. So at a dinner, and to be honest, really had the same point of view as David Cameron about young people, what's sort of missing in terms of getting them involved, talking about youth as an asset. So I really like RockCorps. He said, I know we can't get involved in it, but what do you think about this program I have, National Citizen Service, which I'd heard about. We'd had a glass or two of wine, and so I was a little cheeky and didn't have the real respect that I probably should have. I said, it's for teenagers, right? Yeah, 16-year-olds, you leave your 11, you do this summer of service. And I said, well, if it's for teenagers, you've named it wrong 3 times, National Citizen Service. Like, there couldn't be a worse name for engaging youth. We laughed, and he said, just go check it out. I said, of course, had a nice evening. And I went and visited a site and was just blown away with the collaboration. There was a real emphasis in NCS around social mixing. So if you want, I can break down how the program worked, but a real emphasis on social mixing. So I went in where these teens were presenting their local project, and in the groups of 10 or 12, clearly an incredible mix, in sort of economic level, education level, ethnicity, religion. It was just a beautiful mix, talking with great passion about what they were going to do in their local area. I thought, okay, that was pretty mind blowing. But with any program, particularly youth programs, you can have a pretty crap pedagogy with a great leader. Like a great youth leader can turn anything into something wonderful. I thought, well, maybe they just had great leaders there. Yeah. So I went and visited a second one. No, almost the exact same thing. So I went back to his minister in charge at the time, a great guy named Nick Hurd. And I said, you got something here. I don't think they really know. The curriculum sort of came together by accident. There are a few people that really put it together. You said in your intro, Chris, that I was founder. I'm really clear. I didn't start NCS. I started the trust that manages it, which I'll come on to it. But there are some great people who designed this pedagogy, which is part in-home, part residential, amazingly effective. And so he really got something. He said, okay, but join my advisory board. It's unpaid. We go in about once a month. And I knew that was just sort of a hook for me to do some free gigs for it to sort of up the brand. I did a couple gigs for him. But I kept saying the same thing. It was run by a really great group of civil servants out of the Treasury. And they were young and energetic, first ones in, last ones to go. And it's not necessarily the individuals, it's the system in which they were working. Really risk averse, the civil service tends to be. Really slow moving. I can illustrate this. Do you remember some people call them the riots of the summer of 2011 and started in Tottenham and spread? And there was this great group, self-organized through Facebook, who came out of young people and swept up the next morning. And these things took over. And that became the great story. These brigades of young people coming in and cleaning up the night after these social disturbances. And I said, gosh, we got to get right on this, right? This is exactly it. Let's do a Facebook campaign. Pretty modest budget, like 10 grand. And they're like, right, we love it, Stephen. This is exactly what we hoped you would advise us on. We're going to put this on fast track approval, which takes only 3 weeks. I was like, forget it. Like, you're never going to be able to capture teenagers' attention with that kind of cycle. So I kept saying to Nick, and when I would see the Prime Minister, great program, just it's going to be tough to get off of Go. And they called my bluff and said, would you help us take the management of it outside of government? And so that's what I set up. I went in and I showed Nick and the cabinet minister at this time 12 PowerPoint slides. Says, here's how you would manage it independently. Here are the various functions. Here's a relationship to government. They said, great, would you write a full business plan, which I did. And they said, we really like it. Would you run the transition to set up this new CIC called the NCS Trust? I said, sure. You got to second a couple people to us because I'm now at the end of my sort of volunteering capacity, which they did. And all along they were saying, this is great, and maybe you could join the board, but we'll need to find, they didn't say it this way because they're too nice and well-mannered, but we'll need to find a proper chair, like meaning someone with a decent accent and a better haircut, and I knew what they meant. I said, sure, I'm cool in the gang. I'm just thinking you're making a run. Finally, at the end, the Prime Minister said, look, Stephen should chair it. He knows more about it than anybody else. And it was a long process, but we moved the whole governance of the program outside of government, independent governance, taxpayer funded. So lots of mechanics around the governance. And we were off and running. We tweaked the branding so every young person went through it knows it as NCS. No one really uses its full name, and created a cool sort of world around it. Used a lot of musicians and influencers and athletes and the young people themselves. And by the time I stepped down, I did 6 years as chair. There were 100,000 16-year-olds going through that program every summer for 4 weeks. That's 1 in every 6 English teens was going through it. Incredible. And because of the amount of money the government was investing at the time to do it at that level, it was £175 million a year. It cost about £1,600 a head. It's a lot of charge, that value for money, value for money. But I would often say, and still say, because we have all this research, I said, with that kind of money, you get a lot of research, Ipsos Mori, Kantar, like heavy hitting research. And longitudinal stuff. By 2018, we had 5 years of evidence. Significant increases in civic participation as measured by volunteering, as measured in voting. Significant increases in educational attainment. starting to see, and now we see significant lift in earning potential, significant increase in long-term partnerships. So, either marriage or civil partnerships, long-term decrease in anxiety, huge lifts in empathy for people who are different than me. My place where I live is for all people. Just incredible. And if I said, I found a pill that costs 1,600 and you give it to a 16-year-old and it's going to have all these outcomes, my God, that's great value. Yeah, so that's how I became a patron of it and continue to stay around it. And I think, when you and I last talked, the Secretary of State for DCMS, the sponsoring department, announced in November that they are decommissioning the program, and it will be no longer as of the end of next month.
Yes, optimum and very strange timing for us to have you on, but I think it's a good chance to hopefully to look back and reflect on where you already started out outlining some of the amazing impact that the scheme had, as well as some of the challenges along the way. But I remember those days of the coalition government, and I did feel at the time that the National Citizen Service as a concept and big society as a concept indeed was a real opportunity for the sector to really start to engage young people more in community action and civil society, I suppose, to use two very unyouthful terms. But actually, there was something in there, and I felt personally as a sector that we dismissed that opportunity and failed to grasp the nettle and really make the most of it as a charity sector. I'd just like to pick out some of the things you talked about, but particularly the engaging government in acting much faster. First of all, to get out of the way, to hand it over to people who can make it happen, to allow a much faster turnaround of ideas, a much more dynamic program, a much more youthful feeling. The reason I ask you that is not so much about government, is perhaps more because I think actually, to be honest with you, I think a lot of charities are equally guilty of adding extra bureaucracy or moving too slow or being seen to be too old-fashioned. So I wonder what the sector could be learning from that experience.
Yeah, I think, and it has a lot of answers because there's no silver bullet. I think we all recognize it's interesting. I think our challenge is greater today even than when we started RockCorps 20 years ago and NCS nearly 15 years ago. I've, like all of us, read with interest the various surveys that have been done. The citizenship survey, and I can't remember what it's called now, but basically the ones measuring volunteering, right?
And the community life survey.
That's it, community lives. And it's roughly, since I've been here in 2007, stayed in a trading range of maybe up 2%, down 2%. It's been pretty flat. There's been some shifts in the demographics, like moving younger, moving older, moving more affluent, less affluent. But basically, the overall participation has been pretty static until the last couple of years, and it's really dropped off the table, right? And double-digit loss in volunteering. I'm curious what you guys think. A lot of people talk about COVID, but I think that's right, but in the wrong way maybe, because we're talking about the older retired volunteers who we say, don't come back, it's not healthy and so forth. I haven't done a deep dive on this, Chris, so I'm speculating here, but I think it's a more broad-based societal trend. It's really related to work from home. For COVID, we told everybody, stay back. Uber Eats will deliver to your door. Netflix is a relatively good value. We've sort of lost our muscle of going out, whether that being work or for volunteering or civic engagement. And so I think we as a volunteering leadership need to think really hard about that and how do we address that, right? So I think there's some great challenges for us now that haven't existed before.
I think, I'd go as far as saying that I think over 20 years, probably, we've been offering the same volunteering opportunities and the world around us has changed. COVID was part of that, but technology is. And we've failed. In fact, maybe we've been complacent because we've been able to find volunteers relatively easily over many decades. So we've not tried enough to adapt our volunteering offers, to make them more flexible, to provide different ranges of commitment for different people, especially young people. And I think what COVID did do is I think it's accelerated those issues. A lot of the elder volunteers moved away from volunteering, and we've suddenly realised we've got some catching up to do. And as a sector, I think that's proving to be quite a challenge, personally.
I think I'd And one of the things I'd add, and I'm going to pepper this with a quote from someone who participated in NTS, but also I think my experience of NCS as someone in a charity, in 2012, 2013, 2014, where I engaged with people in NCS, I think the quote I'm about to read basically is from a participant. It says, in the summer of 2014, I was an NCS participant. I was shy, I cared about making a difference, but the thought of volunteering in a pastoral role terrified me. By the time I'd finished, the confidence I had gained encouraged me to take the leap and volunteer at my local care home and primary school for 2 years. There's like a positive story in that, and I think there's something about sort of, for me, society wide, is like, how do we give people the chance to have a go at volunteering? How do we give them that confidence in a sort of structured way that cuts through everything else that's going on in everyone's life? And I'm seeing the big help out is an interesting version of, I think, trying to cut through some of that stuff. And I think more thinking about that, I think, is part of the challenge for us, whether that's how we design our own opportunities that cut through, or how charities work together to cut through. Because I think, our competition is not each other. Our competition is not volunteering, right? Our competition is, all the other things that people spend their time doing. And I suppose to jump back to, in 2013, I was working for a charity at the time. And one of the things I did, and I thought that it was a great example of NCS, was it brought a group of young people in, and my role as part of this, I worked for a charity that was not, we weren't connected to NCS, but NCS reached out to us as a partner in a local community to go, well, can you help? The thing I did, which I really loved, and I got to do about 2 of these a year, but it was fascinating, is I got this group of really energetic, enthusiastic, excited young people in. And my job was to help them prepare for their Dragon's Den style pitch that they were going to do, to secure some funding to do a community action project, right? And the things that people were coming up with were just fantastic and amazing. So there was, and sort of almost to your point, Chris, the thing these young people were coming with was exactly the stuff that cut through all that bureaucracy and stuff, because they were just going to go and do it, and it was really interesting, the experience I was having working for a charity at the time, which was like, I could loop my colleagues and go, you need to come and have a look at this, like, because they're talking about the stuff we're doing, but they're going to go and do it next week, and it's going to be great, like. And I think, what was really exciting is that they could learn from us, we could learn from them, everyone wins. But also, coming back to my point earlier, is like, they were having a go. So they had a go at, effectively preparing a corporate pitch. They had a go at community activism, or, a lot of these things were about raising awareness, or, of things that were close to their heart, and things like that. But I just think that sort of, certainly one of the things that the NCS was really good at for me was that cut through bit, and giving people the chance to have a go at this without, which is what volunteering's about, right? It's about having a go at something, and if you like it, you keep doing it, and if you don't like it, you find something you do like doing, right? That's my experience with it anyway. And I think it was, there was some really great stuff that I think as a sector we would do well to go back and reflect on and think about what was working on that. And because, not all of that stuff requires money and big resource. It sometimes just requires thinking a bit differently and putting young people in the driving seat.
No, you just described perfectly the framework that we use in engaging youth. I get really uncomfortable passing ourselves off as experts. We've just had a lot of reps in the gym, and the framework that you just described is, to engage a young person, you really only need 3 things, and you just described them all. The first is respect, that they have the gifts to be the change makers, right? And by very virtue of them being involved in NCS coming and you going to them, you're respecting them as an equal. The second, they do need some tools. Now, in this case, that's metaphorical, right? You were doing some training, some coaching. And the last is they need opportunity, which was, in this case of your example, the Dragon's Den. Once they do that, like, the respect is so key for any engagement of volunteer. A little bit of training and then the opportunity to go do it, and also fail and then be picked up on the other end. So you illustrated that framework perfectly, Matt. Yeah, it's I think seeing a young person, realizing them as an asset through your eyes, right? So you're looking them, just what you described. You have the solution here, and I want to hear it. Let me tell you how you go about it. There's going to be a Dragon's Den, and I need to walk you through your paces. So I'm going to give you some tools to be successful. But what everybody needs to hear is from you. It's a magic formula.
Where did national service, I mean, where did it fill a gap that wasn't here already, I suppose, in the UK? I mean, some people would say there were scouts, and Matt's involved in the scouts, aren't you?
Yeah.
Guides and all the other youth agencies. Is it about what you said earlier on about bringing people with different backgrounds together? Is it better at that? Where was the gap it was filling?
I think, we took a lot of incoming fire. I think I'm still digging a few arrows out of my back, because
That
there
wasn't
are
an arrow, that was a question.
there was no, there are some incredible organizations here. You mentioned Scouts. Duke of Edinburgh is amazing. There are other incredible organizations. I'll be careful starting to name them because I'm going to miss some. You are a policymaker and you think we need to change the direction of our young people, right? So we're not engaging, they're not civically involved. Is the problem with scouts they don't have enough money? Should we fund the scouts? The bottleneck with scouts always shortage of adult volunteers, right? Duke of Edinburgh, should we just fund them more? I mean, that's a decision as a policymaker. I wasn't in those policy rooms, right? So I can just tell you some of the things that went into deciding to create a new national youth program, which if I was the CEO or chair of one of the organizations that have been at this for 20, 30, 40 years, Princess Trust, another one, right? So Martina Milburn, Dame Martina, who was then the CEO of Princess Trust, had famously come into NCS and then left because it just wasn't working for Princess Trust. She was one of the first people asked to come and join the board, but she did. So let's get it to a point where we can collaborate with King's Trust now, where we can collaborate with Scouts, collaborate with Duke and Barrow World, which by the end of NCS they were. These are all partners, right?
Yeah.
But the case to be made for having a universal national voluntary service, okay? There's a lot of debate whether it should be voluntary or mandatory. Maybe that's another podcast because I think it's an important question. But there's a case to be made that there's a universal taxpayer-funded service for young people. And I'm a big believer in that, right? So that wipes out any bias at all, right? This is an institution created by the taxpayer for our young people. I know Scouts, Duke of Edinburgh, King's Trust should all be partners of that, but there should be above that a national rite of passage for our teenagers. I'm a big believer in that.
And of course, those other agencies are generally speaking providing long commitment volunteering, or at least you turn up and become a member of the Scouts for a substantial period of time, perhaps less so for Duke of Edinburgh and some of the others. But it's still, whereas National Citizen Service was a defined period of time where people got involved, as Matt said earlier on, in a sense, you liked it or you didn't. You tried some things within that you may carry on and do outside of the NCS, but actually it was time bound as well, wasn't it?
It was always meant to be that sort of driving license moment as you left your year 11. Like if you think you do NCS, you go to the Reading and Leeds Festival, and then you go off to college or an apprenticeship, right? It's meant to be that rite of passage. And, all those organizations you just mentioned had important roles, both sort of coming into NCS to that rite of passage. We had gotten to a point where your residential for Duke of Edinburgh could be your NCS, right? So why not tie those two things together? And then for those who are the top of the pyramid, whether that's the top 50% or the top 20%, who are incredibly motivated, super fans, those are places to go and continue your service and keep going on. But even those in the bottom 50%, that was a great, good experience. We had an NPS that was higher than the iPhone, I think even higher than ice cream, right? Like people loved it, right? So, but maybe that's just kind of it. Okay, I get it. I get how community works. I get where my local neighborhood works. I really want to go start my own company, but I've been activated, right? I now see where I live and the people who are here differently. That's its role, and I think there should be a universal rite of passage like that. And I'll keep going on that till there's breath left in my body.
And you managed to get 1 in 6 young people involved, so you must be doing something right. Not bad, not too bad at all.
No.
So NCS has gone, or was going. It's gone?
It's gone. It's winding down, yeah.
Yeah. So, in your view, what are the lessons from NCS that we should ensure that are learnt for whatever succeeds it, and what should follow?
Yeah. So I'm not sure yet if this government is moving towards having a national youth program, right? I'm pretty far away from it, but I'm not getting that sense. They're undergoing a national youth strategy consultation now that's going to be going for the next 6 months and then an additional 6 months. So they're going to come back with a response, but I haven't found a lot of constituents who are saying, right, we need to replace NCS. So I'm maybe proven wrong, but I don't think that's the direction of travel. I think the more important part of your question, that was what lessons can we learn? Okay. And we're really concerned in our work around the isolation of young people. And there are many reasons for this. I blame social media and smartphones getting in the hands too young. That's part of it. There's also a tribalism that's taken over. So I think it's incumbent on all of us that we create opportunities in the real world for people to be mixing from different backgrounds, right? This is the most important part. I love all aspects of NCS, but the opportunities to meet someone from a different religious background, a different economic class, a different part of even your own city that you would never go to. I'm really worried when we don't have that infrastructure in place on a national basis. We're getting too isolated. And I'm still half American, and I watch what happens down the road when the country starts separating into two factions,
Yep.
and you're either right or wrong. It becomes so binary. So the social mixing is incredibly important. David Blunkett, Lord Blunkett, who is one of the board members of NCS, he and I are non-execs of a program called UK Year of Service. So it's meant to replicate AmeriCorps from the States, which is like a domestic sort of Marine Corps, except instead of the military, you go and serve for a year at a real living wage. We've run a pilot we're not an organization, we're an advocacy body just trying to say, hey, we should have a year of service in the UK. It should be one of the options. But David talks a lot about, he's been on this issue. I mean, he's such a legend. He's been on this issue for decades, a real British treasure. He talks about the 900,000 young people right now between 16 and 24 who are not in anything. They're not in education. They're not in training. They're not employed. Like, how can we be having all these talks about the growth agenda, whether there's a third runway? Like, to me, this is the big flashing light on our societal dashboard. We've got this lost group, and it's growing, right? You looked at this 10 years ago, that was 700. Now we're at 900. So what are we doing to address that? I don't sense a concerted effort. So yeah, I think engagement, and particularly an opportunity to be engaged with people who come from different backgrounds is a critical part of the infrastructure for this country. Critical. You can talk about the third runway at Heathrow all you want, or whether HS2 should go to Leeds or not. But I'm talking about real human infrastructure.
It seems like in some ways like we're more connected than we've ever been before, and yet we're less connected kind of emotionally. We're less connected to our our place. We're less connected to the people around us. It's like, it's become easier to be connected to people on the other side of the world, but it's become harder to be connected to people that live down the road, right? And I suppose some of that brings me back to the idea of citizenship, right? Which is like part of it feels like it was part of the recipe of all of this, right? The place and the space and the and the community, what it means to be a community. And yes, there's you can be part of a global community, or yes, you can be part of a community of interest, or whatever. But there's something to be said for like the bit of citizenship that is about participating and about being together and about civic action and about and how we sort of harness that. And I suppose I then get back to sort of your point, Chris, about the opportunities we provide for that. Like we have a responsibility to kind of curate that kind of stuff, to create the apparatus that kind of make that happen and make that possible for young people. Maybe that's something we need to think about, which is if we do have a role in that, if the state has a role in that, if charities and organizations have a role of that in that, like how do we, what are the things we can do, what are those tools we can provide, what are the structures we can create to sort of activate some of that and release that potential, because that can only be a good thing, right? Surely it seems to me some of that, which is certainly what NCS was about, the citizenship bit was about that.
I use a lot of physical terms, and I really do believe citizenship is a muscle, right? You've got to exercise it. It's really difficult to do it through liking a TikTok or sharing an Instagram reel, right? It's a physical action. you do citizenship, right? It's not something you feel, it's something you practice. NCS, I would always say NCS isn't something you did, it's something you're doing, right? Once you're activated. So where are the opportunities? What are the gyms or the physical spaces where we can get people to try it and understand that they have this muscle all along and show them how to use it? It's critical. Matt, there's another aspect because Chris was asking, what we can learn. This is a little tangential, but I think it's critical. And that's the involvement of business in these conversations. I mean, the sort of corporate sector. See, I don't know if you follow the Edelman Trust Barometer. Edelman's a PR firm, and they've been doing this trust barometer for 25 years. They surveyed people in 25 different countries all over the world. It's really robust. I recommend it. We look at it every year. It was just published a couple of weeks ago, the latest one. And it measures a lot about trust, but it measures institutions. So business, government, media, NGOs. And it flipped 3 years ago was the first time business became the most trusted institution in society. Ahead of NGOs, ahead of government. Government sank way down, and media is kind of in the toilet. So I'm not saying that necessarily is right. I'm just observing that people, skews even further when you get younger, are looking to brands that become so ubiquitous in terms of their social leadership. So I think there's a lot of learning to do about us in the charity side of things and our collaboration with business, whether that's locally, nationally, internationally, as opposed to seeing them as a funder where you do your good work and you go and get money from them. And if they don't give you money, then they're crap. More collaboration because these are the institutions that are incredibly important. And certainly government can be inconsistent in its priorities is the nicest way I can say that.
In part takes me back to that sort of holistic oversight that I think we probably lack in a lot of charities because we tend to be pretty blinkered around their own causes. It's sadly quite rare that you hear about charities working together. When you was talking earlier on, for instance, about, we're not sure what the new government's going to do in terms of whether it's going to bring out some kind of youth volunteering social action service of some description, or whether it's just going to fund existing charities or what it's going to do in that space. I was thinking to myself, well, what is the sector's response to that? Should we be encouraging the government to look at this space really carefully? I mean, I'm sure there'll be some within the sector who say, well, no, we just need more money, as you said, into the institutions which work with young people today, and there's an argument for that. But if we want to encourage young people to flex that muscle you was talking about, we want young people to get the citizenship habit. We want them to get involved in social action. And Matt and I would agree entirely that these things, once you get involved, you come back for more and more, but you need to get going in the first place. Where it feels like an NCS-style body, a new one, whatever we want to call it, maybe better titled from the new government, actually is a good investment if it gets people involved at a young age in flexing that citizenship muscle. And we talked, as I'm sure you did, Stephen, when the last election was going on, about the Conservatives' idea of the national service. Again, terribly titled and terribly formed as an idea, and I wouldn't support it. But in an essence, what I would support is something that encouraged rather than was compulsory, but encourage people to get involved in social action in their local or their national communities. And for me, that seems intrinsically a great idea. Clearly, the manifesto proposal was probably not so good, and might be one of the reasons why this government isn't very keen on going along that route. But I think somebody should talk to them about that. Actually, there's something worth exploring in here if it's done well.
Yeah, I think the sort of Rishi Sunak Hail Mary national service has done us a great disservice and set us backwards, right?
I agree.
Made it super toxic. I'll tell you where we got to in our thinking, because we were at 100,000 with NCS, and we could see we'd found this magic pill. It was clear what impact it had, not just on the short term, but over 3 years, 5 years. And once you discover, I have to be careful. Once you discover a medicine or a vitamin like this, you want to give it to everybody, right? And so how do you get more than 100,000 doing it? And we were really interested in integrating into the schools, right? So I think there is a case to be made that during your year 10 or your year 11. I know what I say, I know how complex our education system is, but there's a case to be made where that 3 weeks of citizenship, out of school in the community is integrated into your year 10 or your year 11. And you can opt out, but you do it, the old nudge theory, you do it so it's just part of your curriculum and get everybody having this experience mixing from other schools. I think ultimately that's where you do it, as opposed to making mandatory national service. I think that's problematic. What do you do if people don't do it? Do you arrest them or give them a criminal? There's all kinds of problems with that. But make it something aspirational as part of the school year, and that you're looking forward to since you're year 7. That's the year where we go out and we do great things in the community and meet kids from other places. It's all there, Chris. I just think it's political will probably that is lacking.
No,
I think there are wonderful ideas in this country. This country is rich with social entrepreneurs, and rich with really great intentions, rich with community spirit. It's political will. It's the missing ingredient.
Yeah. And of course, charities don't want loads of people being told they have to do things either. We want volunteers, not volunteers. But
we were talking before we started about Justin Davis Smith. He would send me a thunderbolt if he talked about mandatory volunteering. There is no such thing, right? That's not volunteering. Sorry.
But I do think there's something for us as a sector to be helping to make the case for actually what we want is people to get that citizenship bug and anything that, and I think we should as a sector personally be working towards that.
I think it's the nudge theory. It's the defaults, right? So you're opting out instead of opting in. So how do we integrate? How do we integrate into the flow? We're talking a lot about young people, but really anybody. How do we integrate into the flow of young person's life into corporate life so that volunteering becomes the norm that you just sort of do, and you have to explain why you don't do it as opposed to saying why you do it, right? So it's that nudge theory.
I don't think we can miss the opportunity, Stephen, I don't think we've had any other guests on the podcast, and I doubt we ever will, who has been so successful in mobilising celebrities around social action. But I do speak to lots of fundraisers, of course, who are very successful in getting celebrities involved in their various activities. Yeah. But I almost never hear of it in the world of volunteering. So I wonder if you've got some nuggets of genius to share with our listeners around how they can leverage celebrities and maybe social media as well to get people more involved in giving their time rather than their money.
I think the thing to say first off is we feel like we discovered this perfect machine, and I don't want to take credit for inventing it. We just sort of lined all these things up and all of a sudden it worked. And so I'm going to explain that machine, and hopefully there might be a nugget or two in there. And the way we attack it. We put 5 different elements together in what we call a virtuous circle. Okay, so our gigs are paid gigs for artists, right? So we book the artists to pay these gigs, and we're asking them to do what they're really used to doing, which is going to a venue on a certain night and performing, right? That's not too far out of their comfort space. We do have an extra ask, so everyone who plays one of our gigs, and we work, Rihanna, Lady Gaga, Snoop Dogg, Macklemore we had in Paris last year, a lot of great UK acts. They have to come and volunteer 4 hours as well. So everyone now in the industry knows if you play a RockCorps gig, you gotta come to one of the volunteering. Are we stretching the definition of volunteering with some of these celebrities? Are they doing more photos and selfies with the other volunteers? Maybe, but they're also there in situ, planting, painting, hammering, nailing, cleaning, stacking, sorting. And that's really important. So we book the artist. Okay, so that's number one. So we're not seen as a charity gig. We're not competing with Gavi or UNICEF or Oxfam for a free gig. The other thing about charity gigs to keep in mind, you may get an artist to perform for free, but an artist is one of 20 to 50 people working that night, and there are people making minimum wage holding the kit in and out. So we can't ask them to work for free. Okay, so we pay the artist to do the gig. They love it because it's a new way of meeting their audience, right? And about 30 to 35% of the audience have never been to a gig before. So this is a chance for them to be in front of some their fans who could never afford it because they are time rich, cash poor.
And makes new fans, I guess.
Exactly, a new fan. So they love it. Then you get the fans of the artist who we just mentioned. They want to see that act, and they probably thought about volunteering. It's that intention or ambition gap that we know so well in volunteering. They think they should, but they've never really tried or don't do it on a regular basis. So it's a pretty easy ask. Great, I'm going to see this art. The average ticket price globally for a gig now is 185 US dollars, right? It's way out of reach. I think I'm still paying off the Taylor Swift tickets I bought for my wife and daughter, right? And so they love, the audience absolutely loves it. Do something they intended to do and see this gig. The nonprofit, the charities are absolutely buzzed about it. We work with over 3,000. It's extra work for them, but we do the logistics. Like we bring staff in, we bring the equipment, we do the health and safety, do the insurance. They just have to have a need, but they get quite involved quite often. But they're meeting this new group of volunteers that's really energetic, 50, 100, 150 at a time, sharing their mission, getting their advocacy. And we're kind of the broker. They then transfer over. Those are now volunteers of that charity, right? We introduce them, they sign up for their regular mailing list, their social media. So the charities love it. And to be frank, it's a little bit of rock and roll coming into their charity, right? That's quite fun. They may not get Lady Gaga coming to their charity, but they were around it, right? And there's a little bit of a halo effect on the whole thing. And then certainly the communities are benefiting. That's the fourth person in this circle where these charities are located. You're getting these young people all of a sudden didn't realize this charity was there, now see where they live really differently. That is community infrastructure that's being built. Communities benefit. And then finally, our sponsor, our brands, if we do it right, they're getting all the things that the marketing investment wants. They're getting notoriety, they're getting content, they're getting association with celebrity, and they're getting changed perception of the audience. I didn't know that brand cared about these issues. I didn't know that brand was somebody I could trust like that. Brands have been sponsoring music festivals for decades because that experience of being together with your friends at a music festival is like nothing else. It's a special kind of human experience, and brands want to be in that moment. But what if instead the brand gave a young person a hammer and they built a classroom on the way and then celebrated it? That's 10x. So the brands love it. So we've created this circle where we're asking, and I think this is the key takeaway, asking everybody to do what they do well. We're not asking them to step out and become something different. Artists perform, young people volunteer, go to a gig. Charities have an opportunity and connect with new volunteers. Community, be there and benefit. And the brand get a return on their marketing dollar. Again, we didn't go into a whiteboard session and invent this. We kind of tripped into it. But this is a change the world machine that works on its own power. And I'm fascinated by these.
Yeah, lovely, as you say, virtuous circle.
And probably a lot of like nudges built into that as well by the sound of it, coming back to that idea of nudges. Like some of this seems to be about like making it easy, helping people make those first steps, like getting people signed up as part of the experience. It's all kind of baked into, so if you are going to presumably continue that habit, it's very easy for you. You don't have to go through all that friction again. It's actually, you're there, you're ready to go, sort of thing.
That's a big part of it, isn't it, Matt? And that word you just used, habit, is really critical. We think about this as a transference from an extrinsic desire. I want a ticket. And we use the language of capitalism. Do this, get that. So I'm coming for the ticket. They then, through the physical act, there we are to that physical muscle part again, start to feel the intrinsic driver. And it's really funny. You'll hear it from our volunteers. Hey, so you really wanted to see Macklemore at this big, and they're almost a little embarrassed. Well, no, it feels good to help out. I'm really glad to have the opportunity. That's the shift from the extrinsic reward system to discovering that intrinsic driver, and becomes habit forming, and they'll return it again and again, and they do. So that's the real trip, is that flip, getting you to discover your own intrinsic driver, I think is the secret sauce.
And I don't think that's totally uncommon in a volunteering kind of capacity either, is it, right? Lots of people get involved in things for one reason, but the thing that gets them involved in the first place is not usually, or it's not uncommon for the thing that sort of maintains that activity to change, right? Like the social component, or the skills development, or I don't know, whatever it is that's driving people might not be the key thing that got people there in the first place. And those, having like thinking about what that shift could be for people could also, I guess, be something that's useful for us all to think about, right? Like what's the thing that's going to get people there, but what's the thing that's going to keep people there? And are they the same thing? In my experience, they're not usually the same thing.
I imagine some charities will be kind of purist about it and worried about offering that's such a transactional choice. I think it is worth that gamble, as you say, because it may not be the people's reasons for volunteering in the first place may not be so pure, but actually people aren't that one dimensional when it comes down to it. You know, the transactional bit's there, but actually if you offer a good service and people can see the impact of your cause, they'll come back for more and they'll keep getting involved. And I think that's the gamble we have to take.
The things we're competing against are transactional, though, right? Like we can't ignore that. I would say, like, you know, we've got to if we're going to compete, we've got to think like the competition to some extent.
Absolutely.
The whole world's been Amazonized, right? So it has to roughly function that way. Not quite like that, but you get my point, right? So it's
I had in one click.
Yeah, that's right. Well, customer DBS check in one click. Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah. I think a lot of volunteer recruitment isn't even marketing, it's human resourcing, and it needs to be much more in the marketing sphere. But we probably haven't got time for that conversation today. That's one for next time you come back on the podcast, Stephen.
Love it. We're still learning, and it shifts all the time, right? So it's very different the way we recruit 10 years ago than 20 years ago, right? The audience is shifting all the time. Certainly the tools through which we communicate are shifting, right? Yeah. So it never ends.
But I'm not yet seeing enough proliferation of volunteering conversations or volunteering advertising or on Instagram or on TikTok. So I think there's a lot of space for us to move into and to make some big impact.
It's scary. I mean, I get scared myself when we have the Gen Z come in and operate social media communication. I think, oh God, we're appearing like that. You know, it's quite scary for anybody. And we're meant to be edgy, right? So if you're on top of a 100-year-old charity and you start seeing your offering appearing in that format, it's but that's where the audience is. You know, that's where the young audience is. So it's critical.
And we've got to co-produce it with them, I think, is the answer. Anyway, Stephen, we've taken up a lot of your time. I wanted to say thank you for joining us. I mean, every time I do one of these podcasts, I'm blown away by our guests and the way the directions our conversations go and the depth we get into. And I think we really get beyond and behind these issues, and I think today's been no exception. I think we probably could talk for hours, but it's as we're recording, it's 7:15 in the evening and we ought to let you go. So yeah, thank you ever so much. We'll be watching closely to see how RockCorps in particular develops, and we're watching the government to see how citizenship around young people also develops. If people want to get in touch, Stephen, what's the best way they contact you?
We're just talking about social media. You won't find me on TikTok, but LinkedIn is probably the best way. So I'm Stephen B. Greene on LinkedIn. So search me up there. I'd love to hear from you if it's interesting. You said something, Chris, that really resonated, where sometimes we compete and don't collaborate enough. And I'm so thankful that you and Matt have created this space, because I think the one thing that we can all commit to is rooting each other on. So thanks for creating this space where you're exploring models and rooting everybody on. We're too small, right? We need to be all bound together. Sometimes we're going to compete for some funding, but let's go back cheering everybody on. So I'd love to hear from anybody who wants to connect, and I appreciate you guys creating this space in this podcast.
We're all one team.
Indeed.
Well, thanks, Stephen. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure. Thanks.
There we go, Chris. Another podcast in the bag. I must admit, I was absolutely fascinated by Stephen's story. What a journey! The response in terms of bringing communities together in the sort of wake of 9/11, being invited to number 10 Downing Street, delivering this sort of new program with such reach, scale, and impact. What a story. What were your reflections today?
Yeah, I love talking to Stephen. He's always fascinating, and he didn't say it, I suppose he wouldn't, but, what an example of somebody who just has a dream and says, let's make that happen. I know he's had some help meeting, a phone call from number 10 doesn't do any harm, but, just with RockCorps in terms of just making a leap from a disaster into getting some of the biggest rock stars on the planet to get involved in community action he says it like it's very easy, but actually that's a hell of an ambition to make that happen, and it doesn't seem to faze him. There's so much to take away from working with politicians and others to say, well, actually, no, if you want to make this happen, we need to fast track this, we need to get the bureaucracy out of the way, we need to get the government out of the way, you need to let us get on with this, and we need to make it attractive to young people and dynamic. Just in sheer outputs of the National Citizen Service, 1 in 6 young people every summer involved in such an activity, 100,000 people. It's, again, no mean feat. We should definitely say that, and it's clearly from the metrics that he explained to us, it clearly had an enormous and ongoing impact. And personally, I'm really concerned that the new government, or any government for that matter, should have an eye on this agenda and be thinking, well, what do we fill that void with? Because we do need to have young people flexing and growing and strengthening that citizenship muscle, and it isn't necessarily going to act by accident. Now, we as a charity sector can do something about it. And I think, as Stephen said, businesses can do something about that. And I think there's an onus on us to work in partnership with government, with business, to make that happen. And I suppose that leads me into my last kind of takeaway, was that sort of virtual circle. And I hope I got it right. It was about the brands. And I think we forget that part often in our thinking, in terms of certainly in promoting volunteering. We don't think they're big, do we, in terms of the money? But brands, artists, charities, and potentially government as well, all working together. And if we can get the right mix of people dedicated to making these things happen, then I think, look, he's just showed us what power we can possibly have if we get those things right.
Absolutely. I think I'd agree with you on this. I think we need a strategy, right, for participation, for like activating habits and things. And I think we've talked a lot on this podcast in previous episodes on how it's brilliant that people respond to a crisis, but it also feels a bit depressing in some respects that like some of our key moments around volunteering have been in response to a crisis, and we're not always pointing to the great programs that create great habits and great citizenship examples. And I think a strategy and an investment in that needs to be key. Someone needs to own it. Someone needs to run with it. Someone needs to fund it. And it's important work for sure. So I'd be really interested to see how that shapes up in the future, because it's really key.
And the last thing I would say is, I speak to so many charities who are collectively struggling to grapple with that thing we talked about right at the beginning, the fact that the levels of involvement in volunteering are declining with young people or elder people. If we want to address that, then we do need to learn new techniques in marketing and transactional volunteering marketing if we're going to reach new audiences. I think Stephen's helped us realize some of those potentials and recognizes that, yes, there's new skills in social media and stuff which we may not always have in our charities, but we do need to find ways to unlock them, maybe through other volunteers, to reach out into new audiences. And otherwise, we're just going to have a declining number of volunteers. But I think Stephen brings us hope, and I think we can learn a lot from him.
Agreed.
So yeah, another great episode, I think.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you very much.